disclaimer. It is currently 6:30 p.m. on a Sunday night and I am not going to put on makeup just for this video so that I could just take it off 3 hours later. So I'm sorry, but not really sorry. As much as I love my 30 subscribers, it's not really worth it. Anyway, so today we are talking about something that I'm very passionate about, and that is Basil. I have the Jeff Bezos song stuck in my head and I just wanted to call him Jeffrey Basil. Haha. So the reason I want to make this video is because I love Italian food. I like buying Italian food, I love making Italian food, but most importantly, I love eating Italian food. And one thing that makes Italian food better is basil, first and foremost. And I have, tried times and times again to buy a grocery store basil, such as this one, and keep it alive, but I have never really been successful. But I can proudly say that now I feel like I have finally figured it out. It took a lot of trial and error, mostly error, but now I am ready to spread my wisdom to the world so that you too can have fresh basil with your Italian dishes anytime you want. So in this video, I'm gonna mention the soil, the watering, the light requirements, and also the pruning and propagation. So let's begin! So if you've ever attempted to buy basil and keep it alive, such as this one, this is looking pretty good still because I literally bought it like 30 minutes ago, so it's kind of starting to look a little bit limp, which is why we need to tackle this as soon as possible. So the thing about store-bought basil is that I've heard people say that they sell it in such large quantities because you can see that the pot is literally stuffed with basil. And apparently they do that in order for the basil to die so that you would have to buy another one, which I guess makes sense, but at the same time, if they've been able to keep it alive for this long looking like this, then maybe it's just something that we are doing wrong, but I don't really know. Either way, conspiracy theories aside, the fact is that most of the times, at least every time I have tried to keep it in this nursery pot, it did eventually die on me. As you can see, usually the store-bought basil looks like this. It's very root-bound, the roots are crawling out of the bottom. It's usually really heavily overwatered as well. And the number one thing that I like to do when I get fresh store-bought basil is I like to divide it as soon as possible. So I'm gonna give you an example of what the result of that will look like. So this used to be one basil plant actually that I divided into two and potted in a nice soil mix. I'm running out of soil ingredients, so I'm just kind of, doing the best I can. As you can see, these basil plants are living a happy and healthy life. When you get your grocery store basil, take it out of the pot, divide the individual stems, and then pot them into like 2 to 3 pots, depending on how bushy you want your plant to have. I saw some people pot one stem into one pot, but I feel like that's a little bit excessive. You don't really have to do that, but hey, I'll leave that up to you. Hello! So I was just about to divide this new plant that I bought today, but I realized that a lot of the stems are actually really leggy, as you can see here, for example. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna propagate most of them, if not all of them. And this is perfect because at least it's gonna show you how you can propagate your plants. You just take your stem, I'm gonna cut this one below the node, like this. I'm gonna remove the 2 bottom leaves because they would rot otherwise. And I'm gonna prop it in my vessel. And that's pretty much it. So I'm gonna do that to all of the stems now. Give me a minute. So, I have 2 beautiful basil bouquets and I am left with this little sad boy. The plants that are in here I'm not gonna propagate, first of all because they're a bit too small to be propagated, but second of all I don't have any more space. So in terms of soil, I would say that generally speaking, a chunky soil mix would be better for basil, but at the same time, it is really a moisture loving plant, so whatever soil you put it in, it should ultimately be okay. The only reason that I would prefer chunkier soil mix is to potentially avoid root rot. You can also grow basil hydroponically. I have an example of that here. I would only say that I feel like the basil grown in semi-hydro doesn't taste as good as the one grown in soil, but maybe that's just my prejudice, so I can't really speak objectively on that. And basil grows really fast, so as you can see, I potted this up, I don't know, like 2-3 weeks ago maybe, and the roots are already starting to crawl out, so the roots grow really fast, which is why you might maybe consider separating them a little bit more into fewer stems per pot, but again, I'll leave that up to you. Now, when it comes to water, I already mentioned that basil is a moisture-loving plant, so you need to water this one like really often. This is gonna depend obviously where you have the plant and where you're from, etc. But I personally water these plants in terracotta pots once every 1 to 2 days. It depends on whether it's a sunny day or not. When it's a sunny day, I have to water it more frequently. And one good indication of the water levels on your basil is basically, Sorry, that was so bad. This plant in particular I just watered today, so it's looking fine, but normally when the plant is dehydrated, the leaves kind of start to limp a little bit and they feel really soft and thin as well. So when you get your plant, water it, see what it feels like when it's watered, and then you'll know what it feels like when it's not watered, if that makes sense. The watering is of course gonna depend on whether you have your plant indoors or outdoors. Outdoors you're gonna have to water it more often, also depending on if you have it in a pot outdoors or in a garden bed outdoors. So you'll kind of just have to, yeah, play it by ear and look out for those signs that I just told you to see whether it needs to be watered or not, and hopefully it should be fine. Now, in terms of light, just like with water, basil plants really like light, so if possible you should give them the most amount of light. These basil plants that I have them in an east-facing window, so they get like, I don't know, 5 to 6 hours a day of direct sunlight when there is direct sunlight. As you can see, like the plant is okay. It would probably get bigger leaves if it had more sunlight, but I like having it in the kitchen because it's very convenient. So that's why I'm not gonna put it anywhere else. Yeah, so the more light the better. Don't be afraid of direct light. The only exception to that is if you want to plant your basil outside. And that is because these basil plants that you get from the grocery store, they are, I presume, grown under grow lights and they're not really used to direct sunlight. I transferred one of my basil plants outside into the garden bed and it burned up and died. So if you want to put your basil plant outside, I would first try to acclimate it in full shade meaning in a place where there is shade all day long, so that it would kind of get used to the 360 light, and once it's looking happy, you know, you can start moving it to direct sun. If you're indoors, direct sun all day long is not gonna matter. The plant is gonna love it. Now let's talk about pruning. Pruning and propagation really go hand in hand with this plant. What I mean by pruning is, first of all, what you will do when you want to use your basil for cooking, but also what you will do if you want your basil to grow nice and bushy. So the number one problem with basil is that instead of growing outwards, it normally generally grows up. As you can see on this stem over here, it is very leggy. It doesn't have, except for these two leaves and, you know, these leaves at the top, it doesn't have any foliage. In a case like this, you would want to cut the basil above the nodes so that the energy would be sent into these leaves over here. And that way you're gonna get a bushy plant that's gonna grow outwards instead of up. And it's pretty much gonna double the production of your basil leaves. I have an example here on this, like a plant that I did actually actually prune and it did start growing outwards, so that you can see what I mean. And when you want to use your basil for cooking, this is really important. I always used to just pluck the leaves off wherever I want it, but that's not really the best way to make the basil keep growing. The best way is to actually prune it and usually cut it above the node, because that way, like I said, it's gonna stimulate growth in the lower areas of the plant, whereas if you still leaves, that's not really gonna promote any growth. So if you want to eat your basil, cut it at the top, don't take the leaves off. And similarly with propagation, so if you want to propagate basil, you just cut it off at the top. It doesn't really matter if you cut the plant below the node or above, because as you can see here, hopefully, the basil stems will shoot roots out of pretty much anywhere. I heard someone say that it's better to cut below the node because the roots that grow out of the node make the plant more stable, but I personally haven't really noticed the difference, so I don't think it really matters, to be honest. Right, so when you want to propagate basil, I would recommend that you root it in water first. I have tried planting it directly into soil and I have not been very successful, so if you want to root basil, do it in water first and then stick it into soil, because it's gonna have more of a chance of catching on. And I also want to mention some pros and cons to growing your basil indoors to growing your basil outdoors. Obviously you can do either, you can do both. I personally do both just because I don't know, it's fun to experiment, isn't it? So obviously, like I already mentioned, the number one difference is gonna be in watering. You might have to water your outdoor plants more frequently, in droughts that is. Obviously, if it's raining, you're not gonna have to water it as frequently. Another thing is that for me personally, it's really convenient to have my basil plants on my kitchen windowsill, so that every time I'm cooking, I can just chop it off and put it in my dish, compared to I grow parsley outside actually, and every time I need parsley, I need to, you know, walk outside, grab the parsley, walk back in. It's not as convenient, but it's not really that big of a deal. Another thing is pests. So obviously, if you put your basil outside, it is much more likely gonna have pests. So for that reason, it would be better to have it indoors, but you can obviously just keep an eye on it and see if there are any pests or not. And lastly, the benefit of growing basil indoors is that you can have it all year long. I mean, at least where I live, I couldn't have it outside in winter because it would just freeze over. Right, so I hope you found this video useful. I hope that you will too have an abundance of basil for your Italian dishes. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, comment, subscribe, and follow me on Instagram or TikTok or both. And I will see you here for my next video. Bye!